Houston, Texas, 1963. A city of heat, ambition, and contradiction. A city where the law moved fast and mercy moved slow. It was here, on September 5th of that year, that Gary Lee Graham was born to Willie Graham and Thelma Griffin. Not into wealth, not into stability, into a household already cracking at its foundation. His mother, Thelma, suffered from periodic mental illness. Hospitalizations came and went throughout Gary's early childhood, pulling her in and out of his life like a tide that never decided whether to stay. By the time Gary was 7 years old, he was being raised primarily by his paternal grandmother, Joanne. The structure of family, the thing most children take for granted, was, for Gary Graham, something he was always reaching toward and never quite able to hold. His grandmother would later testify that Gary attended church regularly, that he was not violent, that he was not disrespectful. People who knew him in those early years remembered a boy who showed up to church, to family dinners, to whatever version of normalcy his circumstances allowed. But circumstances in Gary's world kept shifting. His father, Willie Graham, remarried. Gary's stepmother, Elnora, entered the picture, and she would become, decades later, one of the most impassioned voices in the fight to save his life. But in those early years, she was simply a woman trying to hold a fractured family together. By his early teens, Gary Graham had a juvenile record: theft, unauthorized use of vehicles. He had dropped out of school in the 7th grade, and before he turned 16, he had fathered 2 children, a daughter, Deidre, and a son, Gary Lee Hawkins. Read that again. He was not yet 16 years old, and 2 children were already waiting on the other side of whatever life he was going to live. This is not a story about a monster. This is not a story about a saint either. Gary Graham was a deeply flawed young man, shaped by poverty, instability, and a city that had already made up its mind about who he was going to be. But here's what this story is really about. And if you want to understand the most shocking twist in this entire case, you need to stay until the very end, because what happened to his family after his death will change the way you think about capital punishment forever. In 1981, Gary Graham was 17 years old when the Houston Police Department connected him, not through forensic evidence, not through a confession, but through the memory of a single woman sitting in a car looking through a windshield on a dark night in a grocery store parking lot. One witness, one life, one death sentence, and an entire family that no one would ever think to ask, "How are you doing?" That is the world Gary Graham came from. In the next chapter, we step into the night everything changed, May 13th, 1981. A parking lot, a single gunshot, and the beginning of a 19-year nightmare. If you're already gripped by this story, drop a comment below telling me, do you think one eyewitness is ever enough to send someone to death? I want to read every single response. May 13th, 1981. A Wednesday night in North Houston, Texas. The kind of night that feels ordinary right up until it isn't. Bobby Grant Lambert was 53 years old. He had driven in from Tucson, Arizona, a businessman passing through, the kind of man who moves through cities without leaving much of a mark. He had stopped at a Safeway supermarket on Fulton Street to pick up a few things, groceries, simple, unremarkable. The errand that millions of Americans run every single day without a second thought. He paid. He collected his bags. He walked out into the parking lot. He never made it to his car. Visual prompt. A supermarket parking lot at night. fluorescent light bleeding onto wet asphalt, a dropped paper bag. According to court records, an assailant approached Lambert from behind as he moved through the lot. The attacker reached into Lambert's rear pocket, a robbery, quick and calculated. Lambert resisted, and in the moment he pushed back, the gun came up. One shot to the chest. Bobby Lambert staggered backward. He made it back through the supermarket doors, collapsing inside the store he had just walked out of minutes before. Emergency services were called. He did not survive. When police arrived and searched Lambert's body, they found something that deepened the mystery immediately. In his pockets, untouched, undisturbed, was $6,000 in $100 bills. The robber had taken only the loose change from Lambert's pocket. $6,000 left behind. For loose change. Hard pause. Score drops to near silence. That detail would matter later. It suggested panic or inexperience. Or both. Visual prompt, a detective's notepad. A handwriting. Crime scene tape. Investigators canvassed the parking lot. They found witnesses, several people who had been present in or around the lot during the shooting. But here is where the case immediately begins to fracture, and you need to pay close attention to this because it is the foundation of everything that comes after. Of the witnesses interviewed, most said they could not identify the shooter. They never got a clear look at his face. Two of those witnesses, two people standing in that same parking lot on that same night, described the gunman as being between 5'3" and 5'6" tall. That measurement will become one of the most contested facts in this entire case. Visual prompt, a measuring tape, a height chart on a wall, because Gary Graham stood 5'9". Some records put him closer to 5'10", but on the night of May 13, 1981, Gary Graham was not yet connected to this crime. He was 17 years old, living in Houston, already carrying a juvenile record, already a father twice over, and completely unknown to the investigators now standing over a dead man in a grocery store. That would change exactly 1 week later. Visual clock graphic, May 20th, 1981. 7 days after the Lambert murder, police were called to a scene across the city. A 57-year-old taxi driver named Lisa Blackburn had been abducted from a gas station, forced into her own vehicle, driven to a vacant lot, and sexually assaulted. Her attacker then took her to her own home, and there, in what investigators would later describe as a stunning lapse of awareness, he fell asleep. Lisa Blackburn took his gun, she took his clothes, and she called the police. Officers arrived and arrested the sleeping suspect. His name was Gary Graham. Visual prompt, a single lamp illuminating a bare room. Shadows on the wall. What unfolded next moved fast. Police connected Graham to a broader crime spree spanning those exact 7 days, May 13th to May 20th. At least 22 separate incidents. 10 armed robberies to which Graham would eventually plead guilty. 2 additional shooting victims. 1 rape. A 17-year-old boy. 22 incidents. 7 days. The violence of that week is not in dispute. Graham himself acknowledged the robberies. He pled guilty to 10 of them. The evidence of those crimes was real, documented, and damning. But investigators needed to answer one more question. The Lambert murder had occurred on May 13th, the very first day of that crime spree window. A man had been shot in a parking lot with a handgun. Graham had been using a handgun in parking lot robberies. The method matched, the timing matched, the geography matched. So detectives pulled Graham's arrest photograph. They assembled a photo array, and they went looking for someone who remembered that night. Visual. Prompt. A manila folder. 6 photographs laid face-up on a table. They found Bernadine Skillern. She was 45 years old, a school district clerk. On the night of May 13th, she had been sitting in her car in the Safeway parking lot when she heard the shot. She told investigators she had observed the gunman for approximately a minute and a half, watching him through her windshield, from a distance of 20 to 30 feet, in the dark. When he turned toward her, after she honked her horn, she said she saw his face. She followed him briefly in her car before her children's screaming caused her to stop. 13 days later, on May 26, 1981, Bernadine Skillern sat down with investigators and looked at a photo array. She pointed to one photograph. It was Gary Graham. Visual prompt. A photograph face down on a table. A finger pointing, and with that single gesture, one woman, one memory, 13 days old, made through a windshield at night from 30 feet away. The machinery of capital punishment in Harris County, Texas, began to move. Here's what investigators did not tell the jury. Here's what would not come out for years. The Houston Police Department had conducted a ballistics test. The bullet recovered from Bobby Lambert's body was compared to the weapon recovered at Gary Graham's arrest. The bullet did not match the gun. Investigators also knew about the 2 witnesses who described the shooter as significantly shorter than Graham. They did not present those witnesses at trial. 1 witness, no matching weapon. 2 contradicting descriptions buried in a file. Comment below right now if you were on that jury and this was all the evidence you had. Would you have voted guilty? Because 12 people did. And what happened inside that courtroom is even more shocking than what happened in that parking lot. Visual fade to black. A gavel sound in the darkness. The crime had taken 60 seconds. The investigation took 13 days. The trial would take 1. But the consequences for Gary Graham, for his family, and for the people who loved Bobby Lambert would last 19 years and beyond. There is a moment in every flawed investigation where the truth is still retrievable, where the evidence is still sitting on the table, uncorrupted, waiting for someone to pick it up and follow it wherever it leads, even if that place is uncomfortable, even if that place means starting over. In the Gary Graham case, that moment came and went, and almost nobody noticed. Visual prompt. A detective's desk. Folders stacked high. A coffee cup. A flickering overhead light. Let us go back to the beginning of the investigation, because the way this case was built reveals not just the failures of one detective or one prosecutor, but the systemic machinery of a county that had become, by the early 1980s, the deadliest prosecution jurisdiction in the United States. Harris County, Texas, home to Houston, and home to District Attorney Johnny Holmes, a man who served for 20 years and pursued the death penalty in virtually every eligible case his office touched. During his tenure, Harris County alone produced more death sentences than most entire countries. 10%, 1 in every 10 people executed in the modern American death penalty era came from this single county. That is not background noise. That is the atmosphere inside which Gary Graham's case was built. Visual, prompt, a courthouse exterior. Wide shot. American flag. Heat haze. Investigative reports confirmed that within days of Graham's arrest on May 20, 1981, Houston police detectives had assembled a photo array and presented it to available witnesses from the Lambert murder scene. Most witnesses declined to make an identification. They said they had not seen the shooter's face clearly enough, but detectives persisted, and they found Bernadine Skillern. What the record also shows, buried in documents that Graham's later legal teams would spend years excavating, is that there were at least 2 other witnesses at that parking lot who had given physical descriptions of the shooter that did not match Gary Graham. Their statements existed. They were in the file, and they were never presented to the jury. Visual, prompt, a filing cabinet, a drawer sliding open, a hand reaching in, according to court transcripts reviewed during post-conviction proceedings. These witnesses described the shooter as being between 5 feet 3 and 5 feet 6 inches tall. Gary Graham, as measured at his arrest, stood between 5 feet 9 and 5 feet 10. That is a difference of 3 to 7 inches. Not a rounding error, not a marginal discrepancy. A significant material difference in the physical description of the man who pulled the trigger. Those witnesses were never called. Their descriptions were never heard by the 12 people who decided Gary Graham's fate. Hard pause, score drops. But the suppressed witness descriptions were not the only problem, not even close. Visual, prompt, a ballistics lab, steel tables, evidence bags, measuring instruments. The Houston Police Department conducted a ballistics examination, standard procedure in any shooting homicide. They took the bullet recovered from Bobby Lambert's body. They compared it to the .22 caliber handgun seized from Gary Graham at his arrest on May 20th. The results were unambiguous. The bullet that killed Bobby Lambert was not fired from the gun found in Gary Graham's possession. Archival records confirmed this test was conducted. The results existed before trial, and yet the jury that sentenced Gary Graham to death was never told that the weapon he was carrying did not match the murder weapon. Prosecutors would later argue that Graham had used multiple weapons during his crime spree, that the absence of a match to the recovered gun proved nothing because he could have discarded the murder weapon. That is a legally defensible argument. But it is an argument the jury never got to weigh because they were never given the information. Visual, prompt, an empty jury box, 12 chairs, morning light through a high window. Hit the like button right now if you cannot believe that a jury sentenced a man to death without hearing any of this, because it gets worse. Gary Graham's court-appointed trial attorney was a man named Ronald G. Mock. The Graham family had attempted to hire a private defense lawyer. They had made calls, asked questions, tried to pull together the money. They could not afford one. The court assigned Mock to the case. Mock's trial strategy can be summarized in a single sentence: keep Graham's other crimes away from the jury. That was the focus. Prevent the jury from hearing about the robberies, the rape, the shootings, the devastating pattern of violence from those 7 days in May that would have destroyed Graham's credibility before any juror instantly. That strategy had a cost, a devastating one. In pursuit of that single defensive goal, Mock made a series of decisions that Graham's later attorneys would spend nearly 2 decades challenging in courts across the country. He did not aggressively cross-examine Bernadine Skillern about the conditions of her identification, the distance, the darkness, the windshield, the 13-day gap between the crime and the photo array. He did not call the 2 witnesses whose descriptions contradicted Graham's height. He did not present alibi witnesses. people Graham claimed could account for his whereabouts on the night of May 13th. He did not introduce the ballistics report. He rested the defense without calling a single witness. The guilt phase of the trial lasted 1 day. Visual, prompt, a courtroom clock, the second hand moving, then stopping. 1 day, 1 witness for the prosecution, 0 witnesses for the defense, and a 17-year-old boy's life hanging in the balance. Investigative reports revealed that in the years following the trial, multiple people came forward claiming they had information relevant to the Lambert murder, including individuals who said they knew who the real shooter was. Affidavits were filed. Sworn statements entered the record. 2 women, Sherian Adick and Grace Graham, no relation to Gary, signed sworn affidavits stating that they had been in the Safeway parking lot that night and that Gary Graham was not the man they saw. Their statements surfaced years after the trial. Visual prompt, a notarized document, a signature at the bottom, a seal. Bernadine Skillen, for her part, never wavered. Through every appeal, every court hearing, every public debate about the case, she maintained her identification. She had seen his face, she was certain, and the courts, again and again, chose to believe that certainty was enough. According to legal scholars who studied the case extensively, the Graham conviction became a defining example of the dangers of eyewitness-only capital prosecutions, cases where a single human memory, formed under stress in the dark from a distance, becomes the load-bearing wall of a death sentence. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992, would eventually document that eyewitness misidentification is the single leading contributing factor in wrongful convictions in the United States, present in approximately 69% of convictions, later overturned by DNA evidence. There was no DNA in the Lambert case. There was no physical evidence at all connecting Graham to that specific murder. There was one woman's memory, and there was a system that decided that was sufficient. Visual, slow fade. A single light bulb swinging. Shadows shifting on a wall. Gary Graham spent the next 19 years filing motions, writing appeals, changing his name, earning his GED, studying law from inside a cell, trying to do from death row what his trial attorney had failed to do in a courtroom in 1981, and his family spent those 19 years waiting, grieving, preparing for a death that kept being scheduled and then postponed 5 separate times until the weight of that cycle broke things inside them that could never be repaired. Subscribe right now so you never miss a case like this, because what happens inside that courtroom in Chapter 4 is the moment the entire system is put on trial, and the verdict will leave you speechless. Visual, fade to black. A door closing slowly in an empty hallway. The investigation built a case on sand. The courtroom was supposed to be where truth was tested. Instead, it became where truth was buried. Chapter 4 takes you inside 19 years of appeals, last-minute stays, and a family torn apart by a system that kept saying, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." There is a particular kind of cruelty that lives inside the legal system that most people never see. It is not the cruelty of a corrupt judge or a lying witness, though both of those things exist. It is the cruelty of procedure, of paperwork, of a system so large and so indifferent that it can grind a human being and everyone who loves them into dust and call it justice. Gary Graham entered that system at 17 years old. He would not leave it until he was 36, and in between, 19 years of courtrooms, appeals, motions, stays, denials, and 5 separate dates on which the state of Texas told his family to prepare to watch him die. Visual, prompt, a long courthouse corridor, marble floors, echoing footsteps, doors stretching into the distance. The trial itself, the event that started everything, lasted 1 day. October 1981, Harris County. Judge W. Harmon Brown presiding. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Bernadine Skillern. She took the stand. She identified Gary Graham as the man she had seen in the Safeway parking lot on the night of May 13, 1981. She was composed. She was certain. She did not waver. Ronald Mock, Graham's court-appointed defense attorney, cross-examined her, but he did not challenge the conditions of her identification with any force. He did not raise the darkness. He did not raise the windshield. He did not raise the 30-foot distance. He did not raise the 13 days between the crime and the photo array. He did not confront her with the 2 witnesses whose physical descriptions of the shooter did not match his client. He did not call a single witness of his own. Visual, prompt, an empty witness stand, a Bible on the rail, a microphone. According to court transcripts, the jury deliberated and returned a guilty verdict the same day. The sentencing phase followed immediately. The jury was asked to answer 2 special questions under Texas law, questions about future dangerousness and the deliberate nature of the act. They answered yes to both. Under Texas statute at the time, those answers automatically triggered a death sentence. Gary Graham was 18 years old when the judge read the verdict. He had been 17 at the time of the crime. The gavel came down, and the 19-year legal battle began. Visual, prompt, a calendar. Pages turning, years passing. 1982, 1985, 1989, 1993. What followed was one of the most exhaustive post-conviction legal campaigns in Texas history. Graham's case moved through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the federal district courts, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the United States Supreme Court repeatedly. Each court, each panel, each judge reviewed the record and reached the same conclusion: the conviction would stand. The legal arguments evolved over the years as Graham's attorneys changed and deepened their strategy. They argued that the Texas death penalty sentencing statute was unconstitutional because it prevented juries from properly weighing mitigating circumstances, including Graham's age and his traumatic childhood. The U.S. Supreme Court would eventually address similar arguments in other cases, but not in time for Graham. They argued ineffective assistance of counsel, that Ronald Mock's failure to investigate, to call witnesses, to challenge the identification, constituted a violation of Graham's Sixth Amendment right to adequate legal representation. Courts reviewed Mock's conduct and repeatedly found it did not rise to the legal standard required to overturn a conviction. Visual, prompt, a stack of legal briefs, hundreds of pages, a hand placing another folder on top. Investigative reports revealed that Ronald Mock's record as a capital defense attorney was, by any objective measure, alarming. A Chicago Tribune investigation published around the time of Graham's execution examined capital cases across Texas and found that a significant number of death row inmates had been represented by attorneys who presented little to no defense during sentencing. Mock was among those identified. He had represented multiple clients who received death sentences. His preparation in capital cases was described by legal observers as minimal at best. Yet the courts held the line. The standard for ineffective assistance of counsel, established by the Supreme Court in Strickland v. Washington, requires not just that the attorney performed poorly, but that the poor performance demonstrably changed the outcome. Proving that counterfactual in a completed trial is extraordinarily difficult, and so Mock's failures were noted, criticized, and ultimately deemed insufficient to overturn the verdict. Visual prompt: the Supreme Court building, steps, columns, and overcast sky. 5 times between 1987 and 1999, Texas set an execution date for Gary Graham. 5 times his legal team secured a stay. The first execution date in 1987 was stayed pending further appeals. In 1993, 3 separate execution dates were set: April, May, and August, each one carrying the full weight of finality, each one requiring Graham's family to prepare for his death, each one ultimately suspended. In April 1993, Governor Ann Richards, faced with a growing national outcry about the evidentiary questions in the case, granted a 30-day reprieve. She stated publicly that she had concerns. She did not commute the sentence. She did not order a new trial. She gave 30 days. And when those 30 days expired, the machinery started moving again. Visual prompt: a telephone, ringing, a hand reaching for it, then pulling back. In January 1999, a 4th execution date arrived. Another stay was granted by a federal court pending review. Graham remained alive. His family remained suspended between grief and hope, the most psychologically devastating place a human being can be asked to live. Honora Graham, his stepmother, told reporters during this period words that cut to the heart of what the family was enduring. They had tried to hire a private attorney. They could not afford one, and now, almost 2 decades later, they were watching the consequences of that financial impossibility play out in real time. One denied appeal after another, one court after another closing its door. According to peer-reviewed research published in the journal Omega, Journal of Death and Dying, family members of death row inmates experience what clinicians call anticipatory grief, the grief of an expected loss over an extended period of time. In most death row cases, that period lasts years. In the Graham family's case, it lasted 19 years. And it did not arrive once. It arrived 5 times, each execution date a fresh wave of preparation for loss, each stay a reprieve that brought relief and dread in equal measure, because everyone in that family knew another date would be set. Visual prompt: a woman sitting alone in a waiting room, hands folded, eyes fixed on a door. The final legal chapter came in the year 2000. On June 1st, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, the body with the power to recommend clemency to the governor, voted on Gary Graham's case. The result was not close. They voted against clemency. Governor George W. Bush, then the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, days away from the most consequential campaign of his political life, declined to exercise his option to grant a 30-day reprieve. His office stated that 33 judges had reviewed the case over 19 years. The process had been exhausted. The sentence would be carried out. Visual prompt: a governor's desk, a pen, a document. A hand that does not reach for it. Outside the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles building, Reverend Jesse Jackson stood with Graham's family and supporters and wept openly. He had spent weeks working the phones, writing letters, appealing to anyone who would listen. Amnesty International had filed formal protests. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund had submitted documentation of systemic racial bias in Harris County prosecutions. Bianca Jagger had spoken publicly. International pressure had mounted from Europe, from human rights organizations, from the United Nations. None of it moved the needle. The courts had spoken. The governor had spoken. The board had spoken. 33 judges across 19 years had spoken. And Gary Graham's family, Elnora, Deidre, young Gary Lee, had to accept that the speaking was over. What was coming now was not a verdict. It was a death. Subscribe right now, because the final chapter is where everything culminates. The execution. The protests. The son who followed his father into prison. And the question that this case leaves permanently unanswered. A question about innocence, about race, about poverty, and about who in America gets a fair fight. Visual fade to black, a clock ticking, growing louder, then stopping. 19 years of courtrooms, 19 years of appeals, 19 years of a family being told, wait. And then, on June 22nd, 2000, the waiting ended. June 22nd, 2000, Huntsville, Texas. The Walls Unit. The building where Texas carries out its executions does not look like a place where history is made. It is red brick and mortar, ordinary, institutional, a place designed to make the extraordinary feel procedural, to wrap the act of killing a human being in the language of paperwork and protocol until it feels like nothing more than the closing of a file. On this night, the file was Gary Graham. Visual. Prompt. Prison exterior at dusk. Red brick walls. Razor wire catching the last of the evening light. Crowds gathering beyond a perimeter fence. The day before his execution, Graham was transferred from the Polunsky unit, where Texas death row inmates are held in solitary confinement 22 hours a day. To the Walls unit in Huntsville, the transfer did not go smoothly. Graham resisted. He had to be physically restrained. A cell extraction team was deployed. 5 officers required to move one man from one room toward his death. Extra restraints were used. The resistance was documented. It was the resistance of a man who had maintained for 19 years that he did not commit the crime for which he was about to be killed. Visual, prompt, an empty cell, a narrow bed, a small window, afternoon light fading. Outside the prison walls, hundreds of people had gathered, anti-death penalty activists, civil rights demonstrators, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, Danny Glover, supporters who had driven from across the country and from across the world to stand outside a brick building in Texas and bear witness. They were met by counter-protesters, including members of the Ku Klux Klan, monitored by riot police in state helicopters hovering overhead. 8 people were arrested for breaking through police lines. The street outside the Walls unit had become, for one night, a referendum on the American death penalty itself, its history, its racial architecture, its relationship to poverty and inadequate counsel, and the irreversible finality of lethal injection. And somewhere inside all of that noise, standing outside those walls, was Deidre Hawkins, 19 years old, Gary Graham's daughter, pregnant with his grandchild, waiting, visual prompt, a crowd at night, candlelight, faces, tears. At 5:30 in the afternoon, the United States Supreme Court issued a temporary stay of execution. For a moment, just a moment, the machinery stopped. Graham's supporters erupted. Tears, embraces, the desperate, fragile relief of people who have been waiting for exactly this phone call for 19 years. 3 hours later, the Supreme Court voted 5-4. The stay was vacated. The machinery started again. Visual, prompt. A phone being set down slowly, a face falling. Silence returning to a room full of people. At 8:49 p.m. Central Daylight Time, on June 22, 2000, Gary Lee Graham, who had renamed himself Shaka Sankofa, who had earned his GED and a paralegal certification on death row, who had co-edited a prison newspaper and written a book and spent 19 years insisting he did not pull that trigger, was pronounced dead by lethal injection. He was 36 years old. Before the injection took effect, he spoke. His final statement, delivered from the gurney, was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was a declaration. According to the official Texas Department of Criminal Justice record of his last statement, Graham said, "I would like to say that I did not kill Bobby Lambert, that I am an innocent black man that is being murdered. This is a lynching that is happening in America tonight." He addressed his children. He addressed his supporters. He spoke for several minutes, calling out names, expressing love, maintaining his innocence to the last breath available to him. And then the drugs took effect. The 23rd person executed in Texas in the year 2000, the 222nd since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. And now the part of this story that the news cameras left before they could capture. Visual, prompt, an empty street outside a prison. Dawn breaking. Litter from the protest. Quiet. More than 2,000 people attended Gary Graham's wake and funeral. He was buried at Paradise North Cemetery in Houston in a gold-colored casket, wearing a turquoise and gold African garment that reflected the identity he had built for himself inside a 6x10 cell. The man they buried was not the 17-year-old boy who had been arrested in 1981. He was someone who had been forged, however imperfectly, however painfully, by 19 years of fighting for his life. But the funeral was not the end of the story, not even close. Visual prompt, a family photograph, faces blurred. A child's hand. A mother's arm. Deidre Hawkins, Graham's daughter, who had stood pregnant outside those prison walls, gave birth to Gary Graham's grandchild in the months after his execution. She had grown up visiting her father through prison glass. She had learned who he was through protest chants and television news segments rather than bedtime stories and school pickups. The grief she carried was not the clean, socially recognized grief of a daughter who lost a father to illness or accident. It was the disenfranchised grief that researchers describe, grief that society does not acknowledge, does not validate, does not know how to hold. She was not a crime victim in the eyes of the law. She was not a survivor in any recognized category. She was simply a young woman whose father had been killed by the state, and the world had already moved on. And then there is Gary Lee Hawkins, Graham's son, born when Graham was barely 15, raised without a father, watching his father become a global political symbol, not a parent, not a man who came to his school events or helped him with his problems, but an international cause, a name on protest signs, a face on television. 9 months after his father's execution, in March 2001, Gary Lee Hawkins was sentenced to life in prison for murder. He had killed a longtime friend over rent money. prosecutors chose not to seek the death penalty. According to reporting in the Deseret News, Hawkins was approximately 22 years old at sentencing. He would not be eligible for parole until 2040. The son of a man executed by the state of Texas was now serving a life sentence in the same state prison system. The cycle had not skipped a generation. It had not even waited a full year. The United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children has documented this pattern in research spanning multiple countries and multiple decades. The report states directly that unresolved grief following an execution can make it difficult for children of the condemned to become stable parents themselves, and that the death penalty ends up having a lasting intergenerational impact that the justice system never accounts for and never measures. In the Graham family, that impact has a name. It has a face. It has a life sentence attached to it. Visual prompt: 2 prison cells, side by side. Identical bars. Different generations. Elnora Graham, the stepmother who had fought for 19 years, who had spoken to every reporter who would listen, who had publicly blamed Ron Mock's inadequate defense for putting her stepson on death row, was left in the aftermath with nothing but the grief she had been denied permission to express publicly while the world debated whether her stepson deserved to live. She had tried to hire a private attorney. She could not afford one, and she had watched that financial reality become a death sentence for a child she had helped raise. The Bobby Lambert family found no clean resolution either. Dorothy Lambert, Bobby's ex-wife, had said she felt sorry for the Graham family. Bobby Lambert's own wife, at the time of his death, had written to Governor Bush's office opposing the execution, saying she could not live with the possibility that an innocent man had died in her husband's name. Bobby Hanners, Lambert's grandson, had grown up hating Gary Graham, a man he had never met. He witnessed the execution hoping for peace. Whether he found it is not recorded anywhere. 2 families, 1 unresolved case. Both denied the simple, clear finality that justice is supposed to provide. Visual prompt: a split screen. 2 families, 2 sets of empty chairs. 2 kinds of grief. 5 years after Gary Graham's execution, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that executing people for crimes committed as juveniles was unconstitutional. Had Gary Graham committed his alleged crime in 2005 rather than 1981, he could not legally have been sentenced to death. The law changed. Too late for him. Too late for his family. In 2021, 21 years after Graham's execution, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network released a formal clinical guide for mental health professionals working with children affected by a family member's death sentence or execution. It acknowledged formally for the first time in a major institutional document that these children are among the most hidden trauma victims of capital punishment. Hidden. That word. Visual prompt: a child's drawing pinned to a wall. A stick figure family. 1 figure separated by a thick black line. Deidre grew up hidden. Ari Lee grew up hidden. The Graham family grieved hidden, in a country where their pain did not fit any recognized category, did not qualify for any victim services, did not appear in any government statistics about the human cost of capital punishment. The system that killed Gary Graham had no form to fill out for what it left behind. Visual slow fade: a prison fence. Beyond it, a neighborhood. Children on bicycles. Life continuing. Gary Graham may or may not have killed Bobby Lambert. That question, the foundational question of this entire case, was never definitively answered, not by the courts, not by the evidence, not by the execution. What is not in question is this: a 17-year-old boy was convicted on the testimony of one eyewitness. His family spent 19 years in a psychological state that researchers now recognize as one of the most damaging forms of chronic grief a human being can experience. His daughter stood pregnant outside the prison walls on the night the state killed him. His son was in prison 9 months later. His stepmother spent 2 decades fighting a system she could not afford to fight properly from the beginning. And Bobby Lambert's family spent 19 years waiting for a resolution that, even at the moment of execution, did not feel like resolution at all. This is what capital punishment costs, not just in dollars, not just in the life of the condemned, but in the lives of every person connected to them quietly, invisibly, across generations, in ways that no court ever measures and no sentence ever accounts for. Visual final shot, a photograph of Gary Graham, young, before death row, before the world knew his name. Share this video right now. Send it to someone who thinks the death penalty is simply about justice, because this case proves that it is about so much more than that. It is about poverty. It is about race. It is about what happens when a system designed to be final meets a case that was never clear-cut. And it is about the families on both sides who are left to carry what the system puts down and walks away from. If this story moved you, drop a comment below. Tell me, after everything you have just heard, do you believe justice was served on June 22, 2000? Your answer matters. This conversation matters. And if you are watching this and you have never subscribed, do it now. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories that are true. Stories that are documented. Stories that the world needs to hear. Gary Lee Graham. September 5th, 1963, June 22nd, 2000. His children are still living with what happened that night.